Welcome and good afternoon. I am Dr. Tarunjit Singh Butalia, the Executive Director of Religions for Peace USA or RFP USA. RFP USA is the largest and most broadly based representative multireligious forum in the United States and has membership from more than 50 religious communities across our nation. We envision a nation in which people of all faith and goodwill live together in respect and mutual support, creating pathways to peace and justice. Our mission is to inspire and advance common actions for peacemaking through multireligious cooperation among our nation's religious communities. Dear friends, the title of our webinar today is Getting Under My Skin, Anti-Racism for Faith Lay Leaders. As faith leaders, each of us are probably outraged, at least in my case, I'm outraged at this moment of moral crisis in our national identity. This moment of racial outrage is now becoming a movement for racial justice. As the title of today's webinar suggests, we want to have those difficult conversations that get under our skin. Many of us are asking, what do I do as a person of faith next? This workshop will help you with these level 201 questions so we can all grow together in addressing racial injustice in our communities. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you two speakers for today, Brother Corey Leek and Sister Jen Kinney from the Corey Leek Group. Corey is a husband, father, writer, and speaker who has devoted his life working for a better world by facilitating important conversations on issues like race, religion, sexuality, and social violence. He hosts a podcast called Existential and is committed to the work of anti-racism education. Also with us is Jen Kinney. She is a writer, also a podcaster, and a speaker. She is passionate about the power of story to transform culture. After the killing of Trayvon Martin, Jen began digging deeper into the topic of race in our country and started her journey into anti-racism. She discovered her love for podcasting in 2018 and started the podcast Speaking of Racism. At this time, please join me in welcoming Corey and Jen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Taranjeet. Well, welcome to all of you. It is such an honor to be here with all of you, and also just I think an interesting time to be having these types of conversations. I think it's in our nation right now. There's just a lot going on, which we'll get into in a moment. But I first want to start by introducing myself and how I got into the work that we're doing. Jen and I both will actually do that, and I think I got more ingrained in this type of work and these types of conversations right around, I think it was 2016, I believe it was, when Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed. And I think a lot of people forget that Alton Sterling, I want to say, was like a Tuesday and Philando Castile was a Wednesday. So within a span of 24 hours, there were these major, hugely covered incidents of police violence against Black bodies. And as a Black man, you can only imagine. It's interesting. The question of actually how did you get started and how did you get into this work is interesting when you're talking to Black folks, because we are born into this work to some degree. James Baldwin said it perfectly when he said that to be conscious and Black in America is to be in a rage almost all the time. So there's just these things that happened, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, that just sort of struck a real chord with me, struck a nerve. I woke up the next day after Philando Castile, and I was just like in tears. And that was the first time that I was moved to that level of emotion. I mean, Trayvon Martin outraged me. The subsequent exoneration of George Zimmerman outraged me. But I think the first time I felt this sort of deep sadness and the existential crisis of what we are dealing with when we're talking about anti-Black violence in America was around 2016. And from there, I started, some of the things that Tanajit mentioned as in his gracious introduction of me. Those things started around that time. Jen, why don't you share how you got into it a little bit more also?
Yeah, so thanks for that. I got involved in about 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed. For me, I had lived overseas in China for about 5 years. And when I moved back, I decided to start a community conversation project called Food for Thought Dinner Parties. And it was around this idea that we could have difficult conversations when the situation and the setup was a comfortable space and a safe space. And so as I embarked on this journey, Trayvon Martin was killed and tried for his own murder. And that really woke me up to a much larger conversation. Because for me, prior to moving to China, I lived and I grew up in predominantly white spaces. And so I had this really multi-ethnic and just exciting experience living abroad. But moving back to the States, I still moved back into a predominantly white space. The majority of my friends were white. And as I was listening in on the conversations that were taking place, I realized that there were very different conversations taking place in the, to use a broad brush here, white community versus the Black community and other communities of color. And so that got me really thinking about things, and I started to do a lot of listening and learning. And that's how I got involved in my anti-racism journey in a nutshell. And then Corey and I connected. One thing that I do want to say before we really get started here is we are not going to provide, we're not going to provide a lot of PowerPoint presentation and order of operation and how to become anti-racist, because we don't believe that it's that easy. We believe that these kinds of conversations have to take place in the context of communities, relationships, and as you guys are all here, lay faith communities. So that's one thing that we want to put out there. And then right now we actually have a question that we're going to put up because we want to find out a little bit about those of you who are here for the live part of this presentation. Okay, so it looks like a lot of the answers are coming in and people are right around that space of they think so, but they could always learn new things. So Corey is going to talk to us a bit about these terms.
Yeah. First, I think it's interesting. It's like, as you look at the results of this, it almost, Jen, I don't know about you, but almost like you can see, kind of where people are at, I think, by this. I think there's this interesting tension that exists for white folks when it comes to conversations like these. And hopefully, Jen, at some point you and I can get into that, but like where, there's this dance or like this uncomfortable sort of tentative walking into the conversations, like what terms do I use? What terms do I not use? What can I say as a white person? What can I not say? So I think it is actually really interesting and also probably appropriate that a lot of times the best place for white folks involved in this conversation is that I could always learn more because there's so much to unlearn as a citizen of the United States when it comes to issues of race. And I think that, what I'm talking about here, Gina, we can bounce this a little bit back and forth too when it comes to the definitions. But like the first one that comes to mind, because of as I'm looking at the results of this, and not even to say that this is where people are at, but what popped into my mind was this idea of the fear of getting it wrong and getting your feelings hurt, which is to some degree what people refer to as white fragility. It is that like I am going to insert myself into this, and sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes for the wrong reasons. And as I'm inserted into this, and I'll just stick with those who are in it for the right reasons, there will be moments where you misstep. There will be moments, and Jen, you've experienced this, moments where like you're out here trying to do work and there are Black folks that are like, hey, white woman,
Right.
we don't like what you've done or how you've done it. And you have to, like, in that moment, you're confronted with, am I in this for the long haul? Or am I like, are my feelings so sensitive that I can't handle any sort of conflict?
Right.
And, you kind of had to walk through that. I mean, what was that like for you? I mean, because you sort of embodied this like deflecting of white fragility in order to continue to do this work.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was somebody asking this question online the other day, and I could relate to somebody who said, for the most part, I just kept my head down and I knew enough not to speak up and speak out. And that is really challenging for white people. And it's very challenging for white people in positions of leadership. So for the people today who are watching, who are in positions of leadership, a lot of people are tempted to go into this work and they sort of think, okay, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to learn this and I'm going to go to people and I'm going to teach that. And today, some of the things that we want to unpack with you all is that can often lead to some really harmful interactions and definitely more harm than good. So for me in the beginning, it was just being aware of the fact that I am not the expert. I have a lot to learn, and coming in contact with like history that I never learned about, and learning these lessons that, I thought I had a pretty good education. I thought I understood history. And then I would start learning things I'd never learned before. And I realized like, whoa, there is something very wrong here. And I don't know what I thought I knew. So it was very humbling. So staying in that posture was really helpful. Keeping my mouth quiet. I definitely had feelings, and I definitely had moments where things really stung, or when I would get into a place where I'd be triggered about something. And those were always the points for me that I would stop and say, okay, what is going on here? There's something deeper here that I need to address because I'm in my feelings about this, and this isn't about me in this situation. So journaling and just kind of listening to conversations, that definitely helped in the beginning, but also getting comfortable with the idea of the fact that there is a lot of grief involved in this, and giving myself permission to sit in that grief, which is very countercultural in the United States. We are a consumerist culture. We want what we want, and we want it quickly and easily and comfortably. And so oftentimes, despite our best efforts and desire to push into things, it can be difficult to lean into these difficult things because we have been conditioned to flee from that and to seek out easy answers. So getting comfortable, and in my faith tradition, this practice of lament is something that we at least talk about a little bit. But I did learn that we don't do a very good job with it. And so getting comfortable sitting in that as well was really helpful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you touched on so many different things. And I think one of the things that I hear as I'm hearing you talk is is this idea of American exceptionalism, which
Mm.
if you are and it's just the reality, we don't talk caste systems in America often, but it's really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so if you are in the upper caste, which is, the very upper rung of that ladder is a white male, any space you show up in, you show up with this expectation that you are the hero. You're expected to be the most knowledgeable. I mean, and these things are sort of reinforced, as you mentioned, in our education, what we learn about Thomas Jefferson and all of these, these white heroes of history, as well as the white heroes in even mythical heroes and comic book heroes. They're always white folks. And so this psychologically is reinforcing this idea that when I show up to a space, I show up in that space as the protagonist. And what you quickly learn, the more you get into anti-racism, into the history of racism in America, is that you are actually not the protagonist in this story. That if you are entering into anti-racism work, you are realizing that, oh my gosh, like my great, and in some cases just a couple greats, grandparents were terrible to Black folks.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take seriously things like the book, like The Body Keeps Score, something I'm kind of wrestling with now is, what does it mean for me to carry the pain and oppression of my ancestors?
Mm-hmm.
And what does it mean for you, Jen, to carry the oppression, that like the forced oppression, the dominance and the brutality of your ancestors in your body? And that is what we're talking about, to kind of move to another term that is frequently sort of misused and oftentimes debated and argued over, and it's the term racism itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like that very term of racism is, everyone has somewhat of a definition, and for the longest time, I thought that racism was just about my preference. I thought racism was simply if I said something about white people, or if I was stereotypical or just didn't like people based on their race. I thought that's all it was to qualify as racist. And I think with that definition, it's why whenever, and it's also this thing that makes people want to run away from it. So it's like, it's the scarlet letter, if you will, of 2020 for someone to accuse or felt accused of being racist. But here's the reality. In the faith community, especially the tradition that I come out of, the Protestant Christian faith, is there's this understanding and acceptance that every human being is in some way flawed. And so I can accept that there are things that I have a propensity to do right or do wrong, unless we're talking about racism. Because then it's like, there's no way I'm a racist. I can't be a racist. And part of that is thinking that the only way to be racist is to wear a hood, burn crosses, and hate people. But the reality is, the systems that we operate in, the system that rewards a white male twice as much for doing the same work that I do, participating in that system and benefiting from that system, actually, by definition of power, makes you a racist. And I think that was one of the hardest things for me to come to, because as a Black man saying that out loud, you're like, oh man, like, you're being too hard on white folks. But it was a white man was the first person that ever say that said, we were sitting in a circle and he said, listen, because I benefit from these structures, as long as I'm benefiting from them, I am participating in systemic racism in a way that is advantageous to me and disadvantageous to people who are not white. And that's, when we're talking about racism, I think that's, somewhere in the proximity of what we're talking about. And the last thing I'll say, and Jen, let you sort of chime in on this, is that one of the other things that I think makes it hard as we're engaging in this kind of conversation, especially in the United States, is this sort of precise and perfect expectation that we have. So for every word, we need a precise definition for it. Give me the precise definition for racism, so that way I know what to do. There is not. These things are such large philosophical issues that even what I just said is a part of the picture. But there's a whole nother part. There's so much more to it, and it's so nuanced which is why this anti-racism work is a full-time job, because there's so much to discover and so many questions to ask.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point. And I struggle, I kind of vacillate between the two, where on one hand, I think it's important to have a shared language when you have these conversations, because so often when I enter into conversations about racism and white supremacy with people, if we don't share the same foundational understanding of what we're talking about, it creates a lot of chaos and frustration. And yet at the same time, to your point, I've gotten to a point where I just say, what is the point here? Because I've now spent an hour arguing back and forth about when we first started seeing, this concept of prejudice plus power emerge historically in language. And that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, do you know and do you understand the way that race was created, why it was created, and how it impacts us all today? Do you know about the disparity and the inequity in the school to prison pipeline? Like, these are the conversations that I really think that we want to be having. But it is essential to understand, when we're talking about racism, we're talking prejudice plus power. We're not talking about hate in hearts. We're not talking about bigotry. We are in part, right? And to not get caught up in that, I think is, if people can figure out how to do that, I think it's really beneficial. And then white supremacy, like, that is a scary word. How do you feel about the use of white supremacy? Because I remember back in the day when saying I was white offended people. Like, using the term white offends people still. And I forget about that. And I'm reminded on occasion.
People get offended by the term white?
Yes. Saying somebody's white is racist. I'm sure you've heard that. Yeah? No?
I mean, you know what? On the flip side of that, what's interesting is that, like, to your point, I'm glad you brought this up. This is like the historian in you, bringing up the race as a construct, and that's another whole complicated piece of this that makes it difficult for people to understand and to settle into this and go, okay, this thing isn't simple at all. Like, we were handed a really, really bad deck of cards, and we're doing the best we can with it. But so, just a little bit for those that may not know this, like, we didn't arrive here in the United States as black and white. Black became what every African person who was stolen from their land and forced to work here was given as an assignment, so that the dominant culture could know who had privilege and who didn't. So this whole black-white dynamic in and of itself is a construct that its very nature is to establish the dominance, the supremacy of white and the subjugation of black. And I think that's such an important thing for people to understand when we are talking about defining white supremacy, defining racism. And quite honestly, Jen, what you said as you were introducing yourself, you used this term that Trayvon Martin was tried for his own murder. That is racism. That is what you find happening currently in the United States. Whenever there's an incident where a black man is killed, even going back to 2 years ago when Botham Jean, who is in Dallas, Texas, was sitting in his own apartment, minding his own business, eating a bowl of ice cream. He was a worship leader at his church. A white police officer, still don't really know what happened here, somehow wound up in his apartment, shot and killed him. Jen, do you know that the police, after his murder, investigated his apartment to see if they found drugs?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and put him on trial.
That the moment that after George Floyd was killed, that you start to hear about his rap sheet. That when Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by 2 white supremacists before George Floyd, which was the most horrific public lynching we had ever seen until the George Floyd incident, that was a couple weeks after that, that when Ahmaud Arbery was lynched by those 2 white supremacists, that their video surfaced later of him walking into an empty shell of a house that was being built, like people do every single day. Like it
Mhm.
couldn't be that Ahmaud Arbery was potentially interested in building a house or living in
Right.
a neighborhood. It had to be that he was up to some criminal activity. And this is the last thing I'll say before we move on to the next thing, which I hope you know what it is. The like this. I was watching a Cornell webinar, and one
Mhm.
of the professors said something that, and this was a white professor, and it's one of those things that's sort of in your bones. If you're Black, you know this. But he said it out loud, and as an older white professor, it resonated with me. He said, for white folks in America, he said, when you see crime, you see Black, and when you see Black, you see crime.
Mhm.
And I think that statement, that simple statement, is one that I go, yeah. When we are trying to put words next to a colon, that next to racism, to the right of racism, when we're trying to put words there, I think we need to put less words and more stories and more of these types of things, because that helps us have a handle on it way better than any definition for us to go back and forth and argue about on Facebook.
Right. Well, and I think what you've said lends nicely to our transition here and also to a comment here in the chat box. And we will get to comments and questions toward the end, very specifically. So if you do have questions, please put them in there, and we're reserving the last 15 minutes to discuss that. But one person mentioned that when they came to the US 30 years ago, they noticed that they were locking their car door when they would go through Black neighborhoods. So there's even this anti-Blackness that we export through our media. And so if we're exporting this through our media, I remember meeting some friends. This was a long time ago. One of my husband's work colleagues, they were new in the United States. They lived in an area that was predominantly Black at the time. And we went to visit them, and they said out loud what white people in the United States at least knew not to say out loud, but probably thought. And they were just this raw reflection of what we would export in this country. And so they're like, well, Black people are criminals, and Black people, and we're like, no. And honestly, I can't remember. I think I was a little appalled, but I think I was also like, you can't say that. Like, it's wrong to say that. Like, forget that it's just wrong.
Yeah.
But it was such a reflection. It was like Baywatch. Everybody thought American women were Pamela Anderson. Hey, I got news for you. It's not the case. So anyway, that aside, what we're going to talk about here a little bit is the role of white people. So that's what I'm going to talk about, because that's what I can speak to, right? I am a student of anti-racism. I teach in this way. I'm just telling you my story. I am not an educator in anti-racism. That is not my role. So with that said, we white people get into a lot of trouble with our good intentions and our desire to do the right thing. And what we saw this year with the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, was this wave of interest in anti-racism work. And those of us who had been in this work for a long time knew that while the swell of people and interest seemed and felt different, the vast majority of interest would go away. So why is that? And that's kind of what we want to focus on a little bit today. And one of the things that I want to focus on. It goes away because we cannot approach anti-racism like we approach anything else. And if we can understand that we are trained to think as consumers, we will consume. And when we see trauma and when we're moved by it, we can I've heard people explain it as almost like manic in their consumption. So we want to read books, we want to watch videos, we want to listen to podcasts, and we just take it in and take it in and take it in. There comes a point where that is too much for people. And so they either completely fall back and they don't talk about it anymore. They ghost the process, lots of different things. So for those of you here who are interested in, how do I bring this into my faith community? How do I bring this work in a way that is meaningful and long lasting? Understand that there's grief, and understand that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And no, for the white people, our work is to do our own internal work. So that means we sit down, we take on a posture of listening and learning. There are so many amazing books, videos, podcasts. We have a lot of resources that we will put you in touch with. At the end of this, we'll include Corey's contact information, and you can reach out to him, and he and I will work together to give you some recommendations on that. But really, it is important to understand that you need to do your internal work, and your internal work doesn't stop. You will hit places where maybe it's okay for you to get involved in maybe frontline work and activism, if that's what you're feeling qualified to do and called to do. It looks different for everybody. So basically, my big thing is you need to focus on your internal work and not rush to go into a leadership position in this work. So, Corey, what are some of your thoughts on that? Because it looks like you have some.
Yeah, I mean, does my face always give off "I have thoughts" on
Oh yeah,
whatever?
oh yeah.
I have thoughts face. Yeah, I think that I think you covered so much so well about how the work is entered and being humble and entering into the work. And I think also when you're talking about this, one thought I had as you were concluding was just this idea of faith, right? That faith is supposed to be, regardless of what faith tradition you are a part of, faith is supposed to be something that allows us to level the playing field, right? It's this ancient group of people. All of the faiths in the world are ancient faiths. People have been practicing and believing these traditions in divine goodness for thousands and thousands of years. And across all of those millennia, people have discovered that there's people with different strengths. There are people with weaknesses. There are people who need our support and who need our help. And then there are powerful people who, if they are allowed to, will take advantage of, plunder, and destroy people who they have an opportunity to crush and destroy. And so when you're talking about faith and justice, what we are talking about essentially is, how do we make sure that the rich and the powerful are not allowed to run over the poor and the weak on their way to more and more gain? How do we make sure that we all remain tethered to one another in community and in our shared humanity? How do we do that, right? And that's what, at the crux of this anti-racism conversation, we're talking about getting under each other's skins and this difficult conversations that we're having. We're not having them because we enjoy them or because it's sport, or certainly not because it's it's the flavor of the day. We're not engaging in identity politics. This is not something that you're doing just because it's relevant. And I see some, especially our tradition, so many faith-based people move into this kind of work because it's relevant. It's what everyone's talking about, and it's my way of staying up with culture and being culturally relevant. This is something that, like, throughout generations, we have been saying in some form or another. How is there peace? How is this land protected from commerce and capitalism? How is this group of people protected from police brutality and poor schools and lack of resources in their community, over policing and under resourcing of these Black and brown communities? That's the work of saying, how do we have an impact on that? We're not trying to beat Karen in a debate on Facebook. That's not anti-racism work. Anti-racism work should lead to the communities that we have proximity to. How can we affect change in those communities and protect the oppressed and those who are struggling? And one other note I wanted to make, we talked about before, was in faith-based communities, the importance of having diverse leadership, of having people not just represented at the table. Because here's one of the things that I find happening that you'll probably get a kick out of. It's that you have these, let's call it what it is. It's tokens that you'll go, okay, let's get someone who has darker skin, or let's get a woman, or let's get someone who, you know, has challenges with their mental challenges or physical challenges, and let's have them all sit at the leadership table so
Right.
that it appears as though we have diverse leadership, but none of those people have authority. None of those people have the psychological safety to actually speak their truth and say what they believe in those circles. So I think that it's important that people who have the opportunity to build leadership teams, whether it's a board or a staff, that you're mindful of not only just putting up cardboard cutouts of diverse, you know, backgrounds, but actually having human beings who you've given the trust, the safety, and whose voices you listen to.
Mm-hmm. So could I ask you a question at this point?
Yes.
Because
Other than that question, a
right,
second question.
right. So Pamela says, I want to learn, and I just lost it. Pamela says, I want to learn about what role I can play. We have a diverse community of students, but not diversity in our staff body, which is precisely kind of something that we're talking about. And
Yeah.
one of our quizzes, if our quiz master wants to put it up,
Quiz
has
master.
to do with this very question of how many people do you have on staff and in leadership positions who are people of color? And so, like, Corey, I'm listening to you talk about what we need to do to become active in community. And here it is. Oh, no, it's not, but it'll be up there at some point, or not. It's okay. So one of the things that I think about is, you know, we have segregation in this country today. So many people, when I first started podcasting and talking about racism, so many white people would reach out to me and say, I literally live in an area where I can't find a person of color within 100-mile radius. So these are realities. And if you think of these faith communities that are, you know, it's all based on proximity. And so how do we encourage, and what can people be doing to move beyond the token and actually incorporate and shift the staff, the people in the building? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, there's this interesting parable that Jesus is said to have said when he was talking about trying to make an example of what the kingdom of God was like. And it's that if a shepherd would leave 99 sheep behind just for the one that was lost. And somewhere ingrained in to me in ideas about goodness is that even if it's just one person in my community, in my, you know, religious community, in my neighborhood, in my school, on my job, even if it's just one, am I willing to change everything so that that one person can feel more included in what we're doing? And if I truly believe that every human being has the image of God inside of them, and they are created in that image, and that they breathe the same divine energy into their bodies that I breathe into mine, then I have to then have some sort of concern for whatever percentage it is of people who are in my community who need to feel seen, who need to feel heard, who need to, you know, to be reached. And so I hope I'm answering your question, but as I'm, you know, this is the answer that's bubbling up. So I'm running with it. Like, I think there's a thing behind the thing when we're talking about racism, right? Because the thing behind the thing is it's in America, it's been reduced to black and white because that is where the tension is most present. And I think it should start there. I think we should have that conversation. But all over the world, there are people who experience hatred because they're not whatever the status quo is, whatever the dominant culture is. People experience hatred. People experience segregation. People experience oppression because they're not that. And so even in these communities that are more homogenous, you've got, to the question about, or whoever it was that said, I don't have a person of color within 100 miles of me. You do have poor people closer than that. And you treat those poor people, your community, systemically, potentially, I can't speak for every community, but potentially treats those poor people like they're Black, because again, as Jen said so brilliantly in the beginning, race is a construct. So whoever ain't privileged, whoever doesn't have access to the resources, the healthcare, the criminal justice system, all of the things that like treat you like a human being, whoever doesn't have access to that end of the spectrum is Black. That is that, and I think that's the center of it, is that when in the United States, again, this is so important. I feel like we have to come back to, like, in the United States, that when Europeans got here with African people, they said, we're going to divide teams. Okay, you're on the playground. We're going to divide teams. We're going to say, okay, you're white, you're white, you're white, you're white, you're white. All of you with darker skin, you are now Black. You're not African. You don't have any culture. You don't have any religion. You have no ancient gods. You have no history. You are now Black. This is your new identity. You are Black. You work in the fields. You are nothing. You are not even a full human being. So that behind that thing it can't be reduced to color. It has to be something else. So even if you don't see colors in your community, there are still people who in this country don't have and are oppressed, who you should be paying attention to. Hope that answers your question.
That went beyond my question.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that. Okay. Yeah, because honestly, I mean, all the time and all the conversations we've had, I've not heard you speak to this, and I really, this is a profound thing to me. So then, within the context of faith communities and within the context of congregations, that are in multi-ethnic spaces and inhabit that space, but we have people who are saying, we're still not seeing representation in the leadership. What do we do in that? Because for you, I'd love to hear you talk a bit about your experience as a Black man in predominantly white spaces in faith communities, and maybe what you saw as lacking, what you saw as most problematic, and if you have any thoughts on how to change that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was in two environments where most of the staff was white, and it's certainly the head lead pastors were white. One was in Atlanta in a predominantly Black church, and this is interesting. Church is predominantly Black, but the people you see leading things are white. And in that situation, my experience was that I was the go-between, like that these white leaders had difficulty engaging Black folks, didn't want to come across as racist. So I was hey, go talk to so-and-so. Hey, go deal with this situation. Oh, hey, you'll like, and so I think in that situation, it's like I'm leveraged as the person to do the dirty work. The other situation I was in, predominantly white church, both in staff and, I mean, the community of the church was probably a mix of whites, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Indian, like this in the Bay Area. There's a huge Asian population here. So that church was still predominantly white, and the leadership was almost all white. And in that scenario, I felt like I had to prove myself all the time. Like you are having to dispel some of those stereotypes that you talked about earlier. The things that it means to be Black. So even if you're not from I love how that was funny to me. You come to the United States from somewhere else, and you already have your marching orders when it comes to Black folks, right? So you walk into work environments, and in this work environment I was in, having to prove that I knew what I was talking about, having to having expectations on you that aren't clear, and you don't really know what you're supposed to be doing, but you just look around, you know you're doing a good job, but it's just like you never really can find your footing. And especially, as I said earlier, once I started to really recognize what white privilege looked like, it was like every day that I would get up, I would see it clearer and clearer. And then you see it everywhere. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's not like you can turn it off. Like, it's not like
Matrix.
it's right. You're like looking around, you're like, oh my gosh, like this is white privilege, and this is white privilege, and this is white privilege. So I think there's a reluctancy, and this bears out in data and in what you've seen, for whatever reason, Jen, and there seems to be a reluctancy for a large group of white folks to submit themselves to the leadership of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you're going to talk about staffing or having Black folks join the leadership, I think those people need to be leading. And I think that I think that the white folks on staff should be following. I think that's really, in a lot of cases, the only way forward is to not just ask Black folks, like in my first scenario, help me establish white dominance with these Black people.
Right.
Instead of going, lead us somewhere, because you have a whole experience that we have not made a lot of space for. Like, and not just Black. There's LGBTQ plus. There are women. There are people with physical and mental disabilities that like have a perspective that we just don't normally hear. They're not invited to speak at conferences that often. You know what I mean? Like these people who we've pushed aside, they have something to say about God that we all need to hear, and it will blow our freaking minds if we would actually listen. And I think depending on what your scenario is, if you're in a predominantly white setting where most of your staff is white, inviting some people of color and listening to them speak about their experience and about God, you take notes. You don't try to take over. You don't try to take center stage. Let them stay at the center of that conversation and lead you all.
Well, and the thing that we notice in a lot of faith communities is when they take on topics of race and racism, and they bring in speakers, or they bring people in from their community, they often sit up on a stage and they do it like panel style.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I heard, it might have been you who said this a while ago, was don't do the panels. When you bring a Black person in to speak, have them speak, have them teach, have them preach. There doesn't need to be this panel where every single voice and every single person is heard equally, per se, because I think that's kind of what people are going for.
Yeah.
And so really shifting that dynamic. And so if you are a person who is in leadership and you have that power to bring people in and to live this work by saying, I want you to lead and I want you to teach and I'm going to listen, modeling that for people is a really powerful thing as well.
Yeah. And it's I think it's important to know it's complicated, and I think we have to take some questions here, I believe. But like even Jen, you and I'm just like people behind the curtain, when we talked about this session, and I'm looking at the dynamic and I'm going, okay, my work as a man in the United States that has benefited from patriarchy is to say, okay, I'm co-hosting with a woman, she should take the lead. But we have this conversation, you're like, but I'm a white woman. So we're like, so you have this tension that exists where it's like, okay, when it's a dance, man. It's like, we're like going, okay, now in this season that we're in right now with the conversation that's happening, it might be more appropriate for you as a woman. But this season, it's actually the fact that you're a Black man is more important. And it's I think it's a dance, and I think it's a back and forth. And I think when we're dealing with these very complex issues, I love it. I love that it's complicated. I love this mystery. I love we have to work through it, because us working through it means that we're finally being aware of the fact that there are more people in the United States than white land-owning men.
Yeah. So we have a question, and then we're going to bring Tarunjit on because he has questions for us. So Pamela, giving the platform to our diverse student body is the best thing we can do. Yes. And Pamela had sort of stated that she was the question earlier about what to do because they have a diverse student body, but not a diverse staff. I think that is a great idea. And you can get really creative with that, but definitely empowering and sitting back and allowing them to teach.
Yeah.
I think is a really powerful thing. Yeah.
And doing your own work to manage your fear that it's going to get out of your control, because maybe it should be out of your control.
Yeah. All right. So here comes our question. Let's see. Is Tarunjit coming on now?
Yes, I would be glad to. What a fascinating conversation. I know our time is going by quickly, but be that as it may, let me make sure this comes down. Here we go. I want to share one thing and then ask a question. I think we also have a ground problem in this country that racism is not just a problem for white people. Many from my own community who have been so ingrained in the South Asian community along caste lines do not see this whatsoever, and I have talked to many within my own community that use very derogatory words for African Americans. And if I were to translate that into English, it would be the equivalent of an ape. As African American men are not even human. Corey, you talked about that subhuman. There are creams used in the South Asian community that, an example would be the cream is actually called Fair and Lovely. That unless you are fair, a girl or woman is not beautiful. So this kind of racism, I think, pervades many of our communities. And the question I have, and I know we're running low on time, is let us say that my own congregation, my pastor or my religious leader is doing something or makes a comment that is racist. How can I, as a member of the congregation, what should be doing or could be doing? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, it's sort of, to me, it connects back to our whole conversation about defining what we mean when we say racist. I would venture to say that most pastors in America, especially white evangelical pastors in America, have said something racist from the stage. I think that to confront them is the most reasonable thing, is to say, hey, help me understand what you meant when you said this. Maybe I misunderstood you. And if you did fully understand what they were saying, if that pastor or faith leader is willing to engage in a good faith dialogue where you can discuss it, I think that's important. But if in the absence of the good faith dialogue, in the absence of there being a willingness to own up to what was said from the stage, the only thing you could do is leave, take your family and run. That would be my advice.
Jen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, to echo what Corey's saying, absolutely having those conversations. There's a lot of relationship that happens within the context of faith communities, right? You have gatherings probably outside of just your weekly service and relationships with people. So even beyond that, I think, for those who are watching and listening and wondering, like, what can I be doing? What we're talking about is very hard, very long-term work. So even if you go to your pastor and you say, hey, that's problematic and racist, and let's talk about that and unpack that. Beyond that, what is the culture that you're creating within that community? And how can you impact that community? So my job as a white woman who is working to deconstruct this construct of whiteness and who is working to bring about racial justice and equity and these different things, my approach is multifaceted, right? So it starts in my home, it's with my children, it's with my family, it's with my friends and my social groups and my faith community group. And there are a lot of different people who will do book studies, they'll read together, and then they'll unpack things together. And so I think, again, that's a really good thing. But I really caution people to make sure that you are listening and learning from Black voices and educators, and that those are the people who are taking the lead on walking you through what it looks like. Because occasionally I will see people they'll say, hey, I'm going to help you deconstruct whiteness. And I'm looking at them, I'm like, well, you're white and you've only really been doing this work for about 30 minutes. And so are you really the person who is going to help anybody deconstruct or unpack this? Probably not. And so again, it comes back to that point of humility.
Thank you both, Jen and Corey, for sharing your wisdom. We could go on for an hour more, I'm sure, but unfortunately, time does not allow us, and we will be moving along. I also want to thank Bud Heckman, who is the CEO of Interfaith Funders Group, who has worked in the background to make sure we are all well behaved while we have an open and frank conversation. And to all the staff of Upswell, especially Gina Strickland, who managed us in the background. I especially want to thank each one of you for participating in the session today. Next week, friends, Religions for Peace USA will be hosting a week-long National Gathering of Religious Leaders 2020, which will be on the theme of uplifting moral voices for immigration and refugees, faith and action. And this will be held October 19th through the 23rd from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. daily. And in fact, on Wednesday, we have a very special session that is looking at the impact of colonialism and racism on immigration in the United States. On the first day of the National Religious Leaders, we will be issuing a call to action as well as a study guide which can be used by religious communities and study groups for faithful Americans to come and discuss with each other and understand each other's perspectives to gain a deeper understanding on the issue of immigration and refugees. And to register for the gathering, you can go to the link that Bud Heckman will post in the comment box, which is also on your screen now. And you are also welcome to endorse the call to action, either as an organization or sign on to it as an individual. Thank you, friends. Please go in peace as we strive together to create pathways to peace and justice. Thank you and goodbye.